There's a quote, in your attempt to give your children all the things that you did not have, do not neglect to give them the things you did have. Our parents shared with us things that were important to them, and we'd like to pass some of these values on to you as well. We'd like to share them with you that you can see the faithfulness of God.
And you remember in the Bible when the children of Israel came out of Egypt, they crossed the Red Sea. After about 40 years, they came to the Jordan River, ready to cross into the Promised Land. They were instructed by the Lord to take a rock, one man from each tribe, to take a rock and put it on a pile beside the river, so that when future generations would come by and they would say, "What does this pile of stones mean?" Then they would explain to them, generation after generation, how God held back the waters of the River Jordan so that they could cross over into the Promised Land. This is our story, and we're attempting to tell you how God was with us all these years. Probably to understand who I am and what makes me tick, you have to look back to see where my parents came from. My mother's parents were from Germany. Her parents would have been the second generation born in the United States. My grandpa Baumberger owned businesses. He had a brickyard that covered 2 blocks in Lancaster City. He owned a farm at the edge of town. When he passed away, I know that he had 7 houses that he sold, which was divided up into inheritance given to 3 children. My uncle started his business out of it, my Uncle Wilmer. My aunt bought a farm and built a new 3-story house on it. And my mom, because we were on welfare, got a set of false teeth out of it. And my dad, when he was 2 years old, his daddy died from typhoid fever. They were cutting wheat and binding wheat with one of McCormick Deering's first manufactured wheat binding machines. And it was hot, and he drank water from a spring and died of typhoid fever, as I said. And then his mother remarried within a year and gave my dad and his sister to Uncle John Arbaugh in Westminster, Maryland. And he lived there till he was 12 years old and thought he was supposed to get an inheritance by then, and he didn't, so he ran off and never went home. So he just wandered from here and there from Westminster, Maryland to Pennsylvania to Florida to Arizona and everywhere in between. Finally settling in York County, Pennsylvania, he took a job at an insane asylum where he was attacked by an inmate. And in self-defense, he thought he killed the man, so he was on the run for many, many years. When he was 60 years old, he returned to Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where he met my mother, then 40 years old, who was raised in a wealthy family of German descent. There had to be a lot of adjustments made in their marriage. The first year of marriage, Grandpa Baumberger let him live rent-free in a cottage he owned in Peckway, Pennsylvania. During this time, my dad gathered boards and lumber that washed up from floods along the Susquehanna River to build them a house of their own. He bought an acre of land for $50 and built them a house. My sister Grace was born in this house. My mother didn't know she was pregnant. They had been on a walk and she was having a bellyache. So when they got home, my dad put a hot water bottle on her tummy to ease the pain. And shortly thereafter, my sister was born prematurely, weighing 3 pounds 8 ounces. Neighbors, a Navajo Indian couple, kept them from starving by giving them food to eat. A year later, my parents sold that house and built another 12 by 24 shack close to the road where they lived when my brother Phil and I were born. For fear of us kids getting hit by a car on the road, they sold that house and rented an acre of land from a neighbor, Mr. Kramer, and built another 12 by 24 shack where we lived until I was grown. We paid $15 a year rent for the land and a spring and had a garden on it. And that's where we lived till I was 20 years old. When I was young, we lived way back off the road. Us kids ran around like Indians. Because everybody called us Indians, we thought we were. Until I got older and learned that our parents were from Germany originally.
Christian Wenger was born in Bern, Switzerland in 1698 and migrated to Lancaster County, Pennsylvania with his wife, Eve Grable Wenger. Actually, they were not married when they left Switzerland, but were married shortly after their ship docked in Philadelphia on September the 30th, 1727. A very impressive tombstone for Christian and Eve Wenger may be seen today in the Grofdale Mennonite Cemetery, Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. It states that they were born in Emmental, Switzerland, and came to Pennsylvania in the ship Molly in 1727. Christian served as a minister in the Grofdale district of the Mennonite Church. They had thousands of descendants. We are thought to be of Jewish descent. It is interesting to note that the Wenger watches and also the Swiss Army knives originated with our family. My great-grandparents, Michael E. Wenger and Magdalena Musselman Wenger. My paternal grandparents, Michael Musselman Wenger. My grandmother was Fan Nault Wenger. They both died before I was born. Their bodies rest also in the Grofdale Mennonite Church Cemetery. Their sixth son, John Nault Wenger, born July the 19th, 1907, was my dad. My maternal grandparents were Henry M. Sensnick and Mary Catherine Martin. Their third daughter was my mother, Phoebe M. Sensnick Wenger, born February 18, 1907. I only had one grandparent living during my lifetime, therefore my grandpa Sensnick was very special to me. Both these grandparents are also buried in the Grofdale Mennonite Church Cemetery. For better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do us part. So reads the marriage certificate for John N. Wenger and Phoebe M. Sensnick, the 16th day of September in the year of our Lord, 1926. Bishop Benjamin Wenger officiated at the ceremony. Phoebe was a sweet, gentle bride, and John was a handsome groom. Before getting too serious in the relationship, Daddy had wanted to make sure that Mother truly was the one he wanted for his wife. So Daddy persuaded his best friend, Ben Buchan, to drive down to Terry Hill one Sunday afternoon and to try to make a date with my mother. John hid in the running board on the opposite side of the car, listened to the conversation. That Sunday, Daddy heard Mother clearly declare that she was dating John Wenger and she was not interested in dating anyone else. He realized that this was the girl he wanted for his wife. Mother and Daddy, when they first got married, lived in Birdsboro. Melvin and Lester were born there. Daddy worked in a feed mill for his cousin Monroe. A few years later, the Wenger family moved to the farm on Warwick Township side of the Wenger Mill Bridge that spans the Calico Creek. The 51-acre farm, owned by Grandpa Michael Wenger, consisted of a large meadow along the creek and rolling hills of farmland. It had a 2.5-story house, a bank barn, a 4-story mill, a summer house, and a chicken house, which also housed our privy. Daddy and Mother rented the farm from 1928 until my grandpa's death in 1941. I was born in this farmhouse, the 7th child of Mother and Daddy's 12 children. What fantastic memories I have of our family living there.
When I went to school, the kids teased me because we had homemade clothes, and the kids would make fun of us, and then I'd get mad. I'd throw bricks at them and rocks and sticks, and then the big bully would always stop me, or the teacher would drag me into school and slap me down in a seat and try to straighten me out. And I remember one time the bully of the school hit me on the head with a baseball bat, knocked me down on the ground, and I told the teacher, came out, heard the commotion. She drugged me into school and slapped me in a seat. And I said, when I get better, I'm going to kill him. And when I did get better, probably had better sense then not to kill him or fight him back, because I knew he would get me. He's bigger than me. But it was that way all through school, all through 7 years in a grade school, had first grade through 7. And the reason I was 8 years old when I started going to school, because we moved to Delaware to avoid being vaccinated, because my dad was a health nut that didn't want any vaccinations. And of course we lived off the land eating fish and vegetables, and he didn't want us to get vaccinated, so we moved to Delaware. So when we lived at Rehoboth Beach, then the state of Delaware passed a law that you had to get vaccinated there, so we went back to Pennsylvania to the same place where I lived before and got vaccinated. And then when I went to school, they gave me a test and put me in the 2nd grade after I was in 1st grade for about 3 or 4 weeks. My favorite subjects in school were math, English, and geography. We had a lot of spelling bees back in those days and geography bees, and out of the full 7 grades I always ended up with the last 2 people in every test. We had about a half a mile to walk to school, and in the 8th grade I rode the bus to Millersville Middle School, which was a terrible shock, being with hundreds and hundreds of people. I quit school before the end of the 9th grade. I never took my test to know if I passed or not, because everything was seen racked up against me. In later life, when I was 50-some years old, I took my GED test so I could get my real estate license. And I went to Blue Ridge Community College for those classes. I graduated from the School of Hard Knocks, and I'm still learning.
I started school at the Millport School, which was about a mile's walk from our house. It was a one-room school with grades 1 through 7, all in one room and one teacher. I attended school there for my first 7 grades. The first few years I had a hard time walking, keeping up with my older siblings, and I remember how cold I would get walking to school. For 8th and 9th grades, I went to Rossville School. There was about 30 students in our class. Had some stiff competition there, and I wasn't nearly as smart as I thought I was. For 10th grade, I had the privilege of going to the newly built Warwick High School in Lidditz, Pennsylvania. I quit school after my 10th grade. Later, I regretted it, so I took the correspondence course from American schools and got my high school diploma. That finished my formal education, but I've been learning a whole lot since that time. Even now, at 70 years of age, I'm still in the learning process. The farm was a wonderful place to raise the family. We, at an early age, had our chores to do. First, I started out feeding the chickens, as I recall, and then later I learned to milk cows. I thought it was so much fun, and I'd accomplished so much when I learned to milk. Later, it wasn't nearly as much fun. In the summer, I'd pick tomatoes. We grew 3.5 acres of tomatoes and earned money. Mother and Daddy paid us 5 cents a basket, and the basket's about the size of a 5-gallon bucket. It'd be so hot we'd get so hot from working in the sun in the fields. It'd feel so good to head to the creek for a swim at the back of the meadow before milking the cows in the evening. Sometimes we'd have a special treat in the evenings. We'd all pile in the old 1936 Chevy and head to Cloister Dairies for an ice cream cone. My daddy really enjoyed his pigeons. He had some prize pigeons, and he would have them just for a hobby. And also, whenever anybody in the family was sick to the stomach, he would go and sacrifice one of his pigeons and bring it in, and Mother would cook it. Put the broth over toast or crackers, and he always made us feel better when we were sick because he gave us this special treat.
Every week there was a truck came around, a closed-in truck we called a huckster truck, and they sold groceries, almost everything, from toilet paper to groceries, spices, bananas, and they would stop just a couple places in the neighborhood, and they stopped at Seller's Farm, and Mom was there to meet the huckster to buy a couple things to eat. And I was standing there with some of Seller's kids, and I saw tangerines, and I thought, oh, I don't think I ever had a tangerine before that I remembered of. And I wanted a tangerine so bad. And I snuck over there beside Mom, in back of Mom. She was standing right in front of the in back of the huckster truck. And I reached over with my left hand and got me a tangerine and stuck it in my pocket, and Mom happened to see it. And she said, "Put that tangerine back." And the owner, the huckster man, says, "Oh, that's all right, let him have it. That's no big deal." Mom said, "It is a big deal." She said, "None of my kids are going to be thieves." And when we got home, she fixed that problem that I never wanted to steal anything anymore. She took a stick to me. It was a board, not just a stick, it was a board, and boy, did she flatten my tail out. And that fixed me a stealing anything. And you know, at that time it really hurt, but I was just so glad that my mom loved me enough so that she would correct a bad habit that so many people have today.
There was a couple living in the little house that was meant to be just for a summer cottage. But anyway, they were living there year-round. I remember one time when the creek was way out of its banks and the water was rushing through our meadow, the neighbor man was standing in the covered bridge and called to Daddy for help. His wife was terrified, standing on their porch, surrounded by water. Daddy assessed the situation and decided he could safely get to her on the tractor. The problem was, the tractor was in the old mill and it too was surrounded with water. Daddy used our old faithful Belgium horse, Bill, to get to the mill and the tractor. The wheels on the tractor were high enough off the ground that he could drive through the high water to rescue the lady, taking her to the bridge to her husband. His car was on the other side of the bridge, so he could drive her to the hospital where later that day she gave birth to their baby. My parents were always willing to help anyone that needed help. There was a lot of hard work on the farm, but it wasn't all work. We did have time for play and fun too. In the winter time, we had lots of fun ice skating. We also, when it snowed, had fun with our sleds out beside the house. There was a steep hill. So we'd take our sleds out there and the neighbor kids would come in and cousins and everybody loved to come. We'd make sled trains by hooking our feet in the next sled, head down over the hill. We also had a tree house and spent a lot of time up in the tree house having tea parties and playing with our dolls. A favorite place to play was in our 4-story mill. The partitions were removed from the one floor. On rainy days, we'd take our bicycles and tricycles and tractors and scooters and wagons up there and have a wonderful time riding them. With so many children in our family, so many siblings, there was no end of ideas of fun things that we'd think of doing. My mother had an unusual ability to fix a problem no matter what it was. I remember one time we were with her and she was driving the car and the car stopped. So she got out, and this was in her later years. She was probably in her 70s, late 70s. She got out of the car and opened the hood and got underneath there with a screwdriver and did something under there, and lo and behold, the car started up and away we went. My daddy had a little problem in getting his V's and his W's confused. And when he went to talk about getting the victory, it was the victory. And when he was talking about the horse being hitched to the wagon, he would say the wagon.
Dad built a boat. It was a rowboat, and we traveled all over the Lake Aldred was the name of the lake. It was the Susquehanna River backed up from the hydroelectric plant. And we'd go out on the islands and camp out there, catch our fish, and Mom would fry them for us. So that was really happy times when the whole family of us were together. One time we were over in York County. We lived in Lancaster County, and we went the whole way over to York County, which was a mile across the river. and we were fishing, caught us a nice string of fish, and a storm came up. We didn't know it was Hurricane Hazel, which had 70-mile-an-hour winds in it. And we left York County when it started thundering and lightning. The eye of the storm was coming through, and we headed for Lancaster County, and we didn't get far out in the water at all before it was just picking up walls of water like 25 feet high that you couldn't see through, and the wind was just throwing that boat everywhere. We couldn't row it across the river to get home, and we couldn't get back to shore. So we left the current carry us downstream, and finally we came in back of a cliff and tied up the boat, and we ran for shelter in a cabin. There was 2 cabins there. Ran for shelter, and there was 20-some trees blew down all around the 2 cabins there, and Phil got separated from us, and he stayed underneath one of the cabins, and the rest of us ran for the other cabin. When it was all over, we went down, found Phil, then went back down to the river, and there the big poplar tree about 2 foot diameter was snapped off at the trunk, and the boat was thrown upside down over a 10-foot bank and was not hurt. And so we got in the boat and went home. We got part way home, and there was a great big something like a civil defense boat came out and checked to see if we were all right, because they had known we left there in a rowboat before the storm hit. And we weren't hurt at all. We were just so happy that we were all spared, and walked home 2 miles after that and saw roofs torn off of buildings and big trees blown over a whole lot of different places. So we were very, very, very fortunate.
One time we were getting a picture taken. We were out playing, and my mother was taking some pictures. Daddy decided he was in old work clothes and he wasn't bib overalls, and he wasn't fit to be on a picture, so he dropped down behind the peony bush. And my brother John, for fun, grabbed him and pulled him out. And so here's a picture of Daddy being exposed in his dirty work clothes on a family picture. And I remember one night after prayer meeting, I rode with him to put the car in the mill, and we came walking home, and I remember walking up the road with Daddy holding my hand in the dark. And I just felt so special, because I was Daddy's little girl, had Daddy all to myself that night.
Mom used to really get discouraged with Dad. They would have arguments, and I remember it was during berry picking time. And that morning I got up early. She went berry picking. I forget where I went. I probably went berry picking in another direction. And I met her somewhere, and she was really crying and hurt. And I had picked a little bouquet of wildflowers, and I put them in her buttonhole on her dress. Well, she forgot about them in a little while because of her grief. And she walked about 8 miles or more one way to a big hydroelectric plant on the Susquehanna River. And she was going to jump in the tail race where all the rushing water was, probably 100 feet down, and fierce rushing water from the Susquehanna River. And when she looked down, she saw the bouquet of flowers, and then she really cried, and she decided she was going to go home and put up with whatever grief it was, just take care of us kids. That was very special to me that she came back. I was baptized as an infant in the Lutheran church because that's where my mom came from, Lutheran background, where my mother had attended before marriage. We never went to church growing up until one Sunday our family went for 3 days to Sunday school at Colemansville Methodist Church, and my mom said it didn't help. Phil and I still fought, so we stopped going. Later we started going to Rollinsville Mennonite Church for a couple of times, and then Dad got insulted by the preacher. When he took us home, the preacher, and we got out of the car that Sunday, Dad threatened him, saying if you ever come back, he'd get killed. Needless to say, he never did come back. Years went by, and by the time I was 14 or so, some new people from the church came to visit us again and invited us back to church. So we started to attend church again. Sometime later, they had a Bible study in our home, and Mom got under conviction and said she wanted to come back to the Lord. After her marriage, she had walked away from God. I also wanted to go along. I didn't know what that meant. I didn't know if we were going to heaven that night because we were so spiritually ignorant. I knew that Jesus came into my life that night. It was Halloween night, and that was the beginning of my walk with the Lord. Things started happening in my life. The first noticeable thing was when I went to our neighbor, where I used to soap his windows on Halloween night. I now asked him if I could help him shell corn for his chickens. He asked me what was the trick. I told him I had met the Lord, and he said that was a good thing. The next day, I went to school, and the teacher asked me what was wrong. Was I sick? I didn't get in any more fights. I told her I met the Lord. She said she was glad and told me to keep it up. I got an incredible hunger to know God, so I studied the Bible constantly. This upset the powers of darkness and got my dad angry at me every time I failed to perform perfectly.
Church and church activities played a vital part in my life. My parents took me to church and Sunday school before I have any recollection of it. I attended Carpenter Mennonite Church near Talmadge, Pennsylvania from the time I was born until I got married and moved away. We were also married there. My parents were great examples of what a true Christian should live like. I made a decision to accept Jesus into my life and ask his forgiveness for my sins at a revival held by Abram Risser on November the 3rd, 1952 at Carpenter Church. I well remember that night. When the invitation was given, I stood up to show my wanting to become a Christian. The congregation was singing the third verse of Give Me Thy Heart. I was baptized a few months later on March the 8th, 1953. Becoming a Christian was the best decision I ever made in my life.
A friend of mine and I went to a church service because I knew Miriam was going to be there. I met her before at the Latino Mission and at her church. I knew she was going to be at this here other church, so my friend and I went there so I could get a better look at her, because I heard that one of my other buddies was going to get a date with her the next day, and I wasn't going to be the one to lose out. So we waited till after church, and we met them on the way home. They had trouble with her vehicle, and we stopped, and she was in the car, and her and another old girlfriend of mine were in the same car, and they had some unfriendly remarks. And but then in the meantime, after we left them, we went down by the river, my friend and I, and prayed, if it was God's will, that I would get Miriam from my wife, that the Lord would let it happen. So after that, I went to her house. It was going on 11 o'clock because she wasn't home yet, because we knew the time that it was when we left them at where their car had trouble. We got there minutes after she got home, and she said she ran up to see her mom and dad first and get some advice from them and ask them to pray for her, because she didn't know which one of these fellows was going to ask her for a date. So I got in there and knocked on the door, and she come running down real fast and invited me in, and I asked her for a date. And she had other plans at first for a couple of weeks, trying to hold me off, you know. And then when we did have a date, I think it was right around Christmas time, because we went Christmas caroling with my home church at Rollinsville, and then at midnight we went to her home church and sang Christmas carols till morning.
My parents had first met Joe and told me about him, that he loved the Lord, and that was the most important thing. The first time I saw him, I was favorably impressed, thinking he was so handsome, being tall with dark curly hair and the biggest brown eyes and a genuine smile. I loved to hear him play his guitar and harmonic at the same time. I also loved his sense of humor. My parents didn't permit me to start dating until I was 17 years old. December of 1958, Joe and I started dating. After we decided we were going to be getting married, Joe asked my daddy for my hand in marriage, and Daddy said to Joe, "Take good care of my little girl." I always tried to. We had a nice wedding. My wedding dress was beautiful, I thought. I designed it, and my mother and I made it. My sister Phoebe Ann was my bridesmaid, and my friend Miriam Frank was my maid of honor. We were married at Carpenter Mennonite Church on September the 12th, 1959.
And Les Weaver was my best man, and Ken Mellinger was the groomsman.
We decided to go to Niagara Falls and come home through the New England states on our honeymoon.
That was the beginning of our 52 years of marriage, and to show God's faithfulness, how He helps us out in our joys and sorrows, for better, for worse, sickness and health, rich or poor. And we're still together after 52 years and still love each other.
Joe had a way of making me laugh. I remember one experience. He was squeezing a tea bag, and he got his fingers sticky, and so he took his thumb and his forefinger and wiped them underneath his armpits and his shirt. And I asked him what he was doing, and he said he was wiping his fingers, and I laughed and I said, "Under your arms?" And he said, "Yeah, that was the cleanest spot on his shirt." And I thought it was so funny, I threw my head back just laughing, and when I did, I got whiplash and had to go to the doctor.
Many of the most meaningful times with Miriam was when we headed for West Virginia. I liked the mountains of West Virginia and Tennessee and North Carolina, and we'd take off for just short trips. Sometimes we'd stay overnight for a couple days. Then we'd drive along the old back roads, the old trails, even way off the road where cars normally don't go, where only four-wheel drive pickups were supposed to go. And we had plenty of time to talk about everything and to be with each other and have no responsibility other than enjoying God's beautiful scenery and enjoying each other. It's probably the best times of my life.
I loved being a mother, and I thank God for the 3 wonderful sons that He gave us. After 2 years of marriage, we decided to start our family, asking God to help us become parents, and good parents. On November 25, 1961, John Joseph Arbaugh II, the most beautiful baby boy, was born to us. On January 15, 1963, David Brian Arbaugh, just as beautiful, was born. We now had our hands full with our 2 babies, and we're hoping to wait a few years before having another child. So 14 years later, August 30th, 1977, another son, James Daniel Arbaugh, joined our family. He was just as beautiful as his big brothers. We were one happy family. Joe and Dave were so excited about having a little brother, almost as happy as Joe and I were. We were so blessed to have 3 healthy, beautiful sons.
I got a job at a men's clothing store in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where my sister worked. And that was like a cleaning job. And then I got an office job at Daffin Manufacturing, which was a tremendous job. I had my own private car from the company to drive. I carried hundreds of thousands of dollars to the bank. I picked up all their mail and mailed out all their incoming, outgoing mail. They just treated me like gold. We had like 4 branches of the manufacturing company which made mobile feed grinding mills, mixers. So then I went to work for Mellinger Manufacturing, and I worked there maybe a year or so. I quit working there and I got a job doing carpentry, building cabinets and framing up houses, and mostly cabinet work and framing up houses. And then we went into 1W service after we were married, which was an alternative for going into the military. I worked at Mount Wilson Hospital near Baltimore, Maryland, in the laundry. And after service, I went in partnership with a masonry business laying block and brick. We then moved to Virginia and again worked in carpentry for John Miller. In 1970, I started my own business building houses. Out of necessity, I bought a well drill rig to drill the wells for the houses I had built. In 1982, we moved to Haiti to drill wells there. After returning to the States, I decided to do some speculative building. I started to buy and sell properties, remodeling and restoring the houses, which I was still doing at the age of 73.
I got my first paying job when I was 13 at Niedermeyer Celery Farm, putting tile on celery to bleach it. I also babysat for them sometimes. I later was hired as a housekeeper at the Conestoga Motor Inn, working there until I got married. I was privileged to be a stay-at-home mom, enjoyed our sons. I was asked to become a chiropractic assistant for Dr. DeSico. Several years later, Dr. Clark learned of my previous employment and my experience as a chiropractic assistant and asked me to join her practice, the Virginia Chiropractic Center, and I worked there until retirement.
When we first got married, we rented an apartment on Wallbank Road in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. We went into 1W service and we rented a small cottage near Reisterstown, Maryland. And that's where, when Joe was born, but Mom went home. I took Miriam home to her parents so that she could go to General Hospital to have the baby. And so Joe was born in Lancaster in a General Hospital. And 2 years later, we moved back to Pennsylvania, rented a house near Peckway, Pennsylvania, close to where I was born and raised. And there is where David was born. And I had to sell my car, 55 Plymouth sedan, to pay to get Miriam out of the hospital. They wouldn't let her out till I paid the bill. So we thought Dave was more valuable than the car, so we sold the car and got Dave out of the hospital. And then we bought a house near Peach Bottom, Pennsylvania. John Miller called from Virginia and said he wished that we would come to Virginia to help him. They were working with the outcasts back in the mountains in Davis Creek, Virginia, and people were coming to the Lord, and he really enjoyed it, and he said he thinks that would be a good place for us to be. We sold the house at Peach Bottom and bought an old abandoned farm in Schuyler, Virginia, 73-acre farm with a 2-story house on it, which took years to remodel, and it was finally a nice place to live. But we did live in a rented house for about a year.
Joe and Dave were 2 and 3 years old when we moved to Virginia. Their childhood memories would mostly be of living at Schuyler. When Joe started to school, he was the only white boy in first grade. The other kids looked out for him, telling him to get out of their way because they were going to be rough with each other. Dave was so lonely, having no one to play with when Joe went to school, so he became my helper that year. That was the year I had rheumatic fever and had to be on bed rest. Dave was so sweet and helpful. They both spent many happy hours in the sandbox. During the summer, both Joe and Dave would help me mornings with my garden work and canning and freezing, so I could accompany them back to the lake for swimming and having fun when the work was finished. They both were sweet, responsible kids.
Some of the happiest memories with Joe and Dave were when we lived at Schuyler. They weren't dating yet and didn't have their own activities. And we had the ponies. We had 2 big ponies. The one was quarter horse, the other was a big pony, and the other one was a little Shetland. And most of the time I'd ride the little Shetland because my feet would almost touch the ground.
When we lived at Schuyler, we had a St. Bernard dog named Heidi. Joey loved to tease the dog and play tricks on him. So one night he put a bear skin over himself and a coat and came around the side of the house and jumped over the fence toward the dog. And the dog didn't recognize who he was and jumped and pounced on him, and poor Joe ran for his life because he thought the dog was going to get him.
And I can remember, I think it was Dave caught the first fish, and he was so tickled with that fish. And as years went by, he caught some of the biggest fish our family ever caught.
I remember one time we were vacationing together over in the Dominican Republic and decided to go deep sea fishing. So we got up early in the morning. I took some Dramamine so I wouldn't get seasick. And we got there and it was too windy and we couldn't go out in the water. And so I was drugged up all day and hardly remember anything that happened that day.
I'll tell you about Hurricane Camille, which changed our life, my life, for years. We were in South Carolina with Jesse Flowers getting a set of false teeth for him. When we come back, we got stopped in Amherst. And they said you can't get through because all the roads are torn up and the bridges are out. So I asked if there was any other way home, any roads open. And they said no, there weren't any roads open. The bridges were all out, and the ones that weren't out were covered with water or too dangerous for anybody to cross. So we stayed there in a private family overnight, and the next morning we asked the police again if we could go home by Route 60. And he said, yes, you can go home by Route 60 and cross the James River near Goochland. So when we got there to the bridge, they said, we're only letting one vehicle cross at a time and taking the names of everybody in the vehicle in case the bridge lets go and somebody is lost. So they took our names, and I asked Jesse if he was ready to go meet the Lord, and he said, I'm ready. And we had Joe and Dave with us too. And so we all said, we're ready to go. So we took a cross on the bridge and got home, and we found out that almost all our close friends, except a couple on Davis Creek, had drowned or were missing. 120 some people drowned from up in the mountains there, and most of them were our friends, which really put me in a bind emotionally for years, because that's where we felt we were called to be, and all of a sudden it just disappeared. It wasn't there no more. The people were all gone. We searched for bodies for days. Red Cross, Civil Defense, the Army, and I don't know how many different groups, and MDS come in to help look for bodies, and it was a terrible, terrible time in our life. And it took years to try to recuperate from the loss of the good friends, especially those that were saved because of the ministry up in the mountains with them.
When Joe and Dave were teenagers, Joe and I decided that we would like to have another child. So we asked God for a baby, and God sent James. During my pregnancy, a doctor had told me that he felt that the Spirit revealed to him that the Spirit of God was upon the child in my womb, that God had his hand on that baby, and it really seemed to be so as a child. He had an extraordinary passion for God, for the things of God. As a newborn, James had the sweetest little face, not much bigger than a teacup. Being older, Joe and I were more relaxed about parenting and did enjoy it. Having a child on later life was such a blessing for us. James learned to entertain himself. He also loved for us to read to him. We had many good laughs over his trying to yodel and singing "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star." James spent many hours playing in the treehouse he built. Boof Woof was his constant companion. He was overjoyed on his 11th birthday when we gave him his first computer, starting him on his journey, which led him to his present expertise in the field. One Sunday morning when James was little, I was upstairs getting dressed for church. All of a sudden I heard James just squalling, and I couldn't imagine whatever went wrong. And I went to the top of the steps, looked down, and here he was. David had gotten frustrated with him because he told him to be quiet, and he didn't. So Dave grabbed him by his suspenders and his bib overalls and hung him up on the coat pegs at the foot of the stairs. And there James was, hanging in midair, kicking and scared to death, screaming and squalling. When James was little, in those days, when you were driving in a car, you did not need a seatbelt or a car seat or anything. He was standing in the seat beside me as I was driving to Charlottesville, and a truck came by and put on its air brakes, and James said, "Mommy, that truck just sneezed."
We moved to Stewart's Draft, and we've been there now since 1980. At Mountain View, then one time we had a well driller from Haiti came to tell us about their work in Haiti. After the meeting, I asked him what kind of drill that they had, and it was exactly what I was using. So he said, if we ever get in a bind, could we call you to help us out? And I said, sure, which I had no idea they'd ever need me. But anyway, just a month or so later, he called and he said, we're in a bind. The boys that are running, they're not well drillers, and we really need your help. Could you come for a couple of weeks? I said, yeah, I'd go. So that's how we got started in Haiti. Clyde Bender called us again, and he said, we have enough support for you to come to Haiti to drill wells for years. And if you would come, we'd like you to start right away. Well, we said we can't go right away because we had $20,000 debt with well drill and etc. And it was just incredible in the fall of the year when people quit drilling wells because it's cold, and usually business really slacks back in the wintertime for well drillers. And we just had business every day, new wells to drill, new pumps to put in, and in less than 2 months we paid off all our debt and had over $5,000 cash in the bank. It was a very short time, and so we felt then it was, we were ready to come to Haiti. We felt the Lord wanted us there, and the Lord made it clear to Miriam that he wanted us there because she didn't really want to go either because she was never there. And so we moved to Haiti. Dave was going to college to learn police science. He wasn't ready to go with us, which was really a hard thing to leave our one boy at home, because Joe said he was willing to go along, and James didn't have no choice in the matter. He was only 4. So we ended up in Haiti and drilled wells for a couple years and really enjoyed it. One of the most important days in our lives was when Joe and Dave and James gave their hearts to the Lord. May the 11th, 1975, Joe and Dave were baptized at the Rehoboth Mennonite Church at Schuyler. And later on, James was baptized, gave his heart to Jesus, and was baptized August the 5th, 1990 at the Mountain View Mennonite Church. And all 3 of our sons got a good education, graduating from high school and on into college or universities. David was married to Leanne Parker on December the 14th, 1985 at Ridgeview Baptist Church. And Joe II was married to Sharon Rose Keeler on September 19th, 1987 at Weaver's Mennonite Church.
Several times when my parents were quite ill and I needed to get to Pennsylvania in a hurry, Dave would fly me up to Pennsylvania in his airplane, which really cut back in time and made it possible for me to go. Right before my mother died, she had had a stroke and needed special care. I went to Pennsylvania to help my sister Esther care for her. And the morning of her death, I had spent the night with her that night. It was my turn to stay with her. And about 3 o'clock in the morning, I knew that there was something different in her breathing, and I figured it wasn't going to be long, so I didn't leave her side. I stayed with her because I wanted to be with her during that time when her final moment came to leave. My sister Phoebe Ann and I were in the bedroom, and the most unusual thing happened. A dove came and sat on the windowsill and just looked in the room. And while the dove was sitting there, Mother took her last breath. That was so special to be able to be with her at the time when she went to be with the Lord.
Probably one of the most meaningful times that I have ever had with my dad was we were living in Virginia at the time, and he would have been 93 or 94 years old, and we got a call from our doctor in Pennsylvania and said he was in the hospital, and he had double pneumonia, a kidney infection, he had a asthma attack, and a temperature of 104, and he didn't expect him to live. And Mom was visiting us at the time, and she wanted to go home immediately, but our car was broke down. So I called David Miller, and David Miller said he had a brand new car and he was ready to roll. So we all jumped in the car, and in 3.5 hours we were in General Hospital, Lancaster, Pennsylvania, from Schuyler, which broke all records of ground transportation. And we got in there and we met our sister at the door, and she was really upset and wished he would soon kick the bucket and get out of there. And Mom asked if she could go in the room to see him, and when she went in, he was thrashing around, and he was tied in his bed because he wasn't clear in his mind because of the fever and sickness. And I sat there Mom came out and she was really crying and hurt and blamed herself for leaving him, and coming to Virginia to see us with some friends. And I asked the nurse if I could go in and see him, and she said, "Sure, you can go in, but he won't know you." So I went in, and he knew me right away. And I sat there on a chair with him until it was visiting hours were over, and I went back to Miriam's family with Miriam and stayed there with them. And every day I'd go in early in the morning till late in the evening, and he kept thrashing around in the bed and asking me to on time so he could get out of there. And most of the time he didn't know what he was talking about because he was so sick. And then on the third day, he sat up in bed, and I think I untied his one arm so he could sit up. And he said, just right out of King James Bible, he said, Jesus was riding into Jerusalem on a donkey, and they were cutting branches down off the trees and throwing their clothes on the trail and waving palm branches and hollering Hosanna in the highest. And then he got real quiet, and he said, and then just days later they crucified him. But he said 3 days later he came out of the grave, and he went up on Mount Moriah, and he held up his hands toward heaven, and he said, well, he didn't say, Jesus didn't say, but he said he was coming back for people that believe in. And the angel said, why do you stand here gazing into heaven? Because the same Jesus that you saw go up into heaven is going to return. And then he pointed his finger right at my nose, and he said, you know who he's coming back for. And I wanted to say, I know he's coming back for me. But every time I would say something in the past, it would cause trouble. Anger would flare up. I was afraid to say anything. And then he said, he's coming back for you and me. And then he broke down and cried like a baby. That was on a Wednesday. On Saturday, he was home from the hospital. He had no fever. He had no asthma. He had no infection in his kidneys. And he lived 2 years after that. And I told Miriam, I said, we need to go back to Pennsylvania and check to see if this here was just one of those last experiences, you know, before people think they're going to die and they try to get things right, and want to see if this was for real, if it did make a change in his life. And so we went back up to Pennsylvania about 6 months before he died. And he come running out of the trailer. He lived in a little trailer there that Gracie had. And he was so glad to see us, just tickled all to pieces. And he said, oh, he was so glad to see Joey and Davy. And then he said, Mommy's not here, but don't leave. She'll want to see you. She and Gracie went for groceries. They'll soon be back. And so it wasn't too long. They come back and pulled up in the driveway. Gracie's new red convertible Ford. And Dad went running out of the house, and I thought, oh no, I hope this don't break all the peace. And he says, guess who's here? He told Mom, my mom. Joe and Miriam are here from Virginia. Come on in, I'll help you carry this stuff in. And he came in and he said, don't leave, we'll fix something to eat. And that was the last time I ever saw him. I didn't say much about my mom, but she always looked out for everybody. Everybody loved her. She was quiet, soft-spoken, and anybody had any troubles, she always had an ear to listen. Everybody, all the neighbors loved her, the people at the church loved her. When she was about 93 years old, she was in a Brethren home, and they really took good care of her. And Dan Miller had called us, and he said, I'm going to be in Pennsylvania for the weekend, giving helicopter rides to tell people about Wycliffe Bible translators and jars. And I thought, wow, I'm going to see if he would take Mom up for a ride. So I asked him, and he said, sure. He said, I'll be glad to take her up for a ride. So Miriam and I went to the old folks' home, and we made arrangements to meet Dan close by with a helicopter. So we took Dan and myself, put Mom in the middle because the helicopter didn't have any doors on it. It was open, strapped us, we all strapped in, and he took off, and Mom was just laughing and hollering and thought this was so much fun. And he said, you want to fly over the home? Because they're going to have all the other old fogies sitting out there to see the helicopter. So we flew over there, and she looked down at him and waved at him, and she says, look at all them old fogies sitting down there. Of all the difficult, hard knocks that I had, being in a wreck, being on the river in a hurricane, losing so many friends in the other hurricane, knowing the tragedies that happened around us, difficult time is Mom getting rheumatic fever, and all the discouraging times, above all else, I learned to trust the Lord. And that was the only way that I could have any kind of peace at all, was to put my trust in God, that He knew what He was doing. I didn't know. And I couldn't find my way, and I just trusted the Lord to work everything out. And I'm just so glad that the Lord is with me, and I want to burn out for the Lord, whatever it is.
When they were little, we sure enjoyed playing with them, but now that they're young adults, we still enjoy our time we get to spend with them, although it's a bit different these days. Each of them have so many different talents, different, but one just as special as the other.
I'm just so thankful for our family, our 3 boys, and our grandkids. I don't know how we were blessed with such a wonderful family. I love each one with all my heart.
We try to encourage them to make good choices. We pray for them daily, pray for each one daily.
I pray every day that Mom and I and Joe and Dave and James would be faithful to the Lord, and all the boys' wives and our grandchildren, and my brother and sister, that none would be lost, that we'd all live faithful to the Lord above everything else. That's my prayer every day, more than once, that the Lord would lead us and give us a happy life here so we can be together forever in eternity.
Our prayer is for all 13 Arbaughs to spend eternity together around God's throne.